My name is Eleanor Vance. I am a United States federal judge.
A federal judge? Yeah, right. Lady, that's a good one. Prove it.
The Saturday afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the manicured lawns of Oak Creek Estates, a neighborhood where the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze was often the loudest sound to be heard. Inside the stately brick colonial at 112 Crescent Drive, United States federal judge Eleanor Vance was enjoying a rare moment of tranquility. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of pages as she turned them. A half-finished glass of iced tea sat sweating on a coaster beside her favorite armchair, its contents a testament to an afternoon spent blissfully disconnected from the weighty matters of the federal courthouse. At 58, Eleanor had earned these moments. Her career, built on a foundation of sharp intellect, unwavering integrity, and a deep respect for the rule of law, had been both demanding and distinguished. She had stared down corporate malfeasance, dismantled organized crime rings, and presided over landmark civil rights cases, all with the same measured calm she now applied to her weekend reading. The sudden sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the silence like a shard of glass. It wasn't just a ring. It was an insistent, impatient press that suggested urgency. Eleanor frowned, placing a leather bookmark in her novel. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her husband, a retired history professor, was at a conference in Chicago, and her son was serving overseas. Deliveries were usually left on the porch, and her friends knew to call first. A second chime, longer and more demanding than the first, echoed through the foyer. With a sigh, she set her book aside. Perhaps it was a neighbor in need of something. The community was tight-knit, and such impromptu visits, while uncommon, weren't unheard of. She walked to the front door, her bare feet cool on the polished hardwood floors. Peering through the peephole, her sense of calm evaporated, replaced by a familiar flicker of professional caution. A police officer stood on her porch. He was young, likely in his early 30s, with a blocky, athletic build that seemed constrained by his crisp uniform. His hair was cut in a severe military style, and his jaw was set in a hard line. He wasn't scanning the street or looking relaxed. His gaze was fixed intently on her door, his posture radiating an aggressive impatience. He wasn't alone. A second officer, a woman with a weary expression, stood a few paces behind him on the walkway, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. This wasn't a neighborly visit. Eleanor took a deep breath, her mind automatically shifting from leisurely repose to analytical assessment. She evaluated the scene as she would a piece of evidence presented in her courtroom. The lead officer's demeanor was confrontational. The time of day was unusual for a casual police inquiry. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, no apparent emergency. Her instincts, honed by decades on the bench, told her something was amiss. She unfastened the deadbolt but left the chain latch engaged, opening the door a few inches. A sliver of bright sunlight streamed into the dim foyer, illuminating the determined scowl on the officer's face. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said, her voice even and polite, betraying none of the questions swirling in her mind. "Can I help you?" The officer's eyes narrowed, sweeping over the visible portion of her face and the interior of her home. He didn't return the greeting. Instead, he gestured vaguely at the house, his thumb hooked into his duty belt. "We received a call," he stated, his voice flat and accusatory. "A report of a suspicious person on this property." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "A suspicious person? Here?" She glanced past him to the serene, empty street. Her nearest neighbors were either out or quietly enjoying their Saturday indoors. The only people on her property were herself and the two officers now standing before her. "I can assure you, officer, there's no one here who shouldn't be. I've been home all day." The officer, whose name tag read D. Miller, seemed unimpressed by her assurance. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small opening of the doorway. The scent of starched fabric and strong cologne wafted in. "That's what we're here to determine, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I need to ask you a few questions. First of all, "What are you doing in this house?" The question was so absurd, so loaded with unfounded suspicion, that Eleanor was momentarily taken aback. It wasn't a question one asks a homeowner standing in their own doorway on a sunny Saturday afternoon. It was an accusation, and she knew instantly that this encounter was not a simple mistake. It was something else entirely. Judge Vance processed Officer Miller's question. "What are you doing in this house?" Not as a simple inquiry, but as the opening salvo in a confrontation he seemed determined to have. In her courtroom, she had seen this kind of behavior before. A prejudgment, an assumption of guilt looking for a fact to cling to. It was the hallmark of poor policing, and it set every one of her internal alarms ringing. She held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated or flustered. Her home was her sanctuary, but it was now also a stage, and she would not be miscast as a suspect within its walls. "I live here," she answered, her voice remaining perfectly level. She infused the two words with a quiet finality, a statement of indisputable fact that should have ended his line of questioning. Officer Miller, however, appeared to take her answer as a challenge. A small, incredulous smirk played on his lips. He shifted his weight, placing one hand on his hip, a classic power stance. "You live here," he repeated, drawing the words out as if tasting them for falsehood. He tilted his head, his eyes doing another slow, deliberate sweep of her face and the sliver of the grand foyer visible behind her. He saw the marble floor, the base of a sweeping staircase, a piece of abstract art on the wall. The signs of affluence were unmistakable. His gaze returned to her, a middle-aged black woman in a simple linen dress, her hair pulled back, no jewelry save for a simple wedding band. In his mind, she did not match the house. "Is that so?" he continued, the condescension in his voice thickening. "And what's your name?" "Eleanor Vance," she replied, still calm, still unyielding. He nodded slowly, mockingly. "Eleanor Vance. And can you prove that? Do you have some identification that shows you belong at this address?" The request was procedurally improper and deeply insulting. The Fourth Amendment protected citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures, and a demand for identification without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity was a clear overreach. Eleanor knew this as well as she knew her own name. She could have challenged him right then and there, could have cited case law and constitutional protections. But she also knew that escalating the legal argument with an officer who was clearly operating on prejudice rather than procedure would be fruitless. For now, she would play along, letting him build the case against himself. "My identification is in my purse on the hall table," she said. "But before I get it, could you please tell me exactly what the suspicious activity was that prompted this visit? Who made this call?" Miller's jaw tightened. He was losing control of the interrogation he had initiated. "I'm not at liberty to disclose the identity of the complainant. The call stated that a person matching your description was seen entering the home through a back window. It looked like a break-in." It was a clumsy, almost laughable lie. The back of her house was surrounded by a high brick wall, and every window was connected to a state-of-the-art alarm system that was currently active. There was no silent entry possible. He had fabricated a premise to justify his presence and his suspicion. "A back window?" she repeated, allowing a note of incredulity to finally enter her voice. "Officer, every window and door in this house is wired. If anyone had tried to enter, the alarm would have alerted not just me, but your department directly. There has been no alarm." Her logical, factual rebuttal only seemed to irritate him further. His partner, the female officer who had remained silent on the walkway, shifted uncomfortably. She seemed to sense the direction this was heading, but she said nothing, her silence a form of passive consent. "Look," Miller snapped, his patience gone. "Are you going to show me your ID or not? If you refuse to cooperate, I'm going to have to assume the worst." "Assume the worst?" Eleanor echoed, her voice now edged with steel. "Assume that a woman in her own home on a Saturday afternoon is a burglar. On what grounds, officer? Because I opened my own front door when you rang the bell?" "On the grounds that you're being evasive and uncooperative," he shot back, his voice rising in volume. He was leaning in now, his face uncomfortably close to the gap in the door. "This is a beautiful home, a very expensive neighborhood. We have a duty to investigate when things seem out of place." The implication was ugly, naked, and undeniable. You are what's out of place. He wasn't investigating a crime, he was investigating her very presence in her own life. The thin veil of police procedure had been torn away, exposing the raw prejudice beneath. Eleanor knew this was a critical juncture. She had given him the chance to de-escalate, to retreat from his baseless accusations. He had refused. Now, she would have to guide him down the path he had so arrogantly chosen. Judge Vance recognized this moment for what it was, a constitutional inflection point. Officer Miller was no longer conducting an investigation, he was perpetrating an act of intimidation, fueled by a narrative he had constructed based on her race and her gender. His partner, Officer Calloway, remained a silent statue on the lawn, a bystander to a slow-motion abuse of power. Eleanor's training as a judge kicked in, overriding any personal feelings of anger or insult. She needed to manage the situation, document it, and establish an unimpeachable record of events. "Officer Miller," she said, her tone shifting. It was no longer the voice of a startled homeowner, but the measured, authoritative cadence she used from the bench. "Let me be perfectly clear. There is no suspicious activity here. You have not articulated any reasonable suspicion of a crime being committed. You have, however, made a number of baseless and insulting insinuations. I am not legally required to provide you with identification under these circumstances. However, in the interest of resolving your apparent confusion, I will do so." She maintained eye contact with him. "But first, you will step back from my door. You are too close, and your demeanor is aggressive. Step back onto the porch." Her command, delivered with the quiet force of someone accustomed to being obeyed, seemed to startle him. For a moment, he looked like a schoolboy being reprimanded by a principal. He hesitated, his pride warring with the unexpected authority in her voice. Finally, with a slight, almost imperceptible sneer, he took one grudging step back. It was a small victory, but a significant one. She had re-established control over her personal space. "Thank you," she said crisply. "Now please wait here." Without breaking eye contact, she closed the door to the point where the chain allowed, leaving only a tiny gap. She turned, her movements deliberate, and walked to the antique mahogany table in the center of the foyer. Her purse was there, just as she'd said. She retrieved her wallet, her heart beating a steady, rhythmic tattoo against her ribs. She was not afraid, but she was acutely aware of the danger of the situation. An officer like Miller, full of bluster and prejudice, was unpredictable when his authority was challenged. She pulled out her driver's license. The photo was a few years old, but it was clearly her. The name Eleanor Vance and the address, 112 Crescent Drive, were printed in clear, unambiguous text. This was the proof he had demanded, the key that should have ended the entire absurd encounter. Holding the license, she walked back to the door. She did not unlatch the chain. Instead, she passed the small plastic card through the gap. Miller snatched it from her fingers. He held it up, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. He looked from the photo to her face, then back to the photo. He read the name and address aloud slowly, as if sounding out the words. Eleanor Vance, 112 Crescent Drive. He looked up from the license, but the suspicion in his eyes had not abated. If anything, it seemed to have hardened into a new form of disbelief. "This is you?" he asked, his tone suggesting it was a forgery. "It is," she confirmed. "And you live here, alone?" "My husband is out of town," she said, choosing not to grace the impertinent question with a more detailed answer. "Officer, you have my identification. It confirms my name and my residence. Is there anything else?" He held on to the license for a moment longer, tapping its edge against his thumb. He was stalling, his mind clearly racing as he tried to find a new angle of attack. His initial premise, that she was a burglar, had been disproven, but he was too committed to his own narrative to simply apologize and leave. To retreat now would be to admit his judgment was flawed. that his entire basis for the stop was rooted in bigotry. Men like Miller did not admit fault easily. "What do you do for a living, Ms. Vance?" he asked, the question coming out of left field. The query was utterly irrelevant to any legitimate police matter. Her profession had no bearing on a phantom burglary call. It was a question designed to probe, to categorize, to place her within a social hierarchy that made sense to him. He was trying to reconcile the expensive house with the black woman who stood before him. Eleanor paused. She had a choice to make. She could refuse to answer the inappropriate question, further escalating the standoff. Or she could answer it. She could give him the final piece of information that would either bring this farce to an immediate, crashing halt or propel it into an entirely new and more dangerous stratosphere. She had tried logic. She had tried compliance. Now it was time for the truth, in its full, unassailable weight. "My profession is not relevant to your inquiry, officer," Judge Vance stated, her voice calm but firm, a clear boundary being drawn. She could see the flicker of frustration in Officer Miller's eyes. He was accustomed to deference, to citizens answering his questions without challenge, especially when he projected an air of authority. Her refusal to play along was a direct affront to the power he was trying to wield. "Ma'am, a little cooperation would go a long way here," he said, his voice taking on a syrupy, patronizing tone that was far more insulting than his earlier aggression. "I'm just trying to get a complete picture of the situation. It's a simple question." "And it's a simple answer," she retorted, her patience wearing thin. "It has no bearing on why you are on my property. You have my identification. It confirms I live here. Your fabricated story about a break-in has been disproven. You have no legal cause to remain on my porch, and you certainly have no right to interrogate me about my personal life." Every word was precise, deliberate, and legally sound. She was not just a citizen pushing back, she was an expert in the law, defining the boundaries of his authority to his face. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty seemed to cross Miller's features. He was likely used to citizens who were either intimidated into compliance or became emotionally volatile. He was not used to someone who could dismantle his entire basis for being there with such clinical precision. His partner, Officer Calloway, shifted her weight again, this time taking a half-step back, subtly distancing herself from him. Miller glanced back at Calloway, a silent, frustrated communication passing between them. He then turned his attention back to Eleanor, his expression hardening again. He was in too deep to back down. His ego was now fully invested in winning this confrontation. "All right, fine," he said, trying to regain the upper hand. "Don't tell me what you do, but your attitude is raising a lot of red flags. We're not leaving until we're satisfied that everything is above board." He handed her license back through the gap, almost throwing it at her. Eleanor caught it smoothly. "My attitude, as you call it, is that of a citizen who knows her rights," she said. "And as for you being satisfied, you have no legal standard of satisfaction to meet. You have reasonable suspicion, or you have nothing. You have nothing. I am now asking you and your partner to leave my property." It was a formal legal instruction, a trespass warning. To remain now would be to break the law. This was the final line. Miller stood at a precipice, and he had to choose. He could leave, defeated and humiliated, or he could commit fully to his disastrous course of action. He chose the latter. "We're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and menacing. "In fact, I think we do need to come inside. We need to sweep the house, make sure there's no one else here, make sure you're not under duress." It was a desperate, transparently flimsy pretext for entering her home without a warrant. Eleanor stared at him, a profound sense of disappointment settling over her. Disappointment in the uniform he wore, in the system that had given him a badge and a gun, and in his personal failure to uphold the oath he had sworn. She had given him every opportunity to walk away. She had been patient. She had been logical. She had been firm. Now she would have to end it. She let out a slow, deliberate breath. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering and powerful, the same gaze that had made seasoned litigators tremble in her courtroom. The quiet homeowner was gone. The insulted citizen was gone. In her place stood the full authority of her office. "You will not be entering my home without a warrant," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than if she had shouted. "You are now trespassing, Officer Miller, and you seem to be operating under a significant misapprehension of who you are speaking to." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I am a United States federal judge for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I am ordering you, as an officer of the court and a citizen under my jurisdiction, to vacate my property immediately." The words landed in the space between them with the force of a physical blow. Officer Calloway's eyes widened in shock, her mouth falling slightly agape. She took another involuntary step backward. Officer Miller's condescending smirk froze on his face, then melted away, replaced by a wave of disbelief, followed by the sickening, pale realization of his catastrophic error. The air on the porch, once thick with tension and aggression, was now charged with a new and terrible silence. He wasn't just hassling a citizen anymore. He had been unlawfully detaining and threatening a federal judge. His career, which moments ago had felt so secure and powerful, was now hanging by the thinnest of threads over a canyon of his own making. The silence that followed Judge Vance's declaration was profound. It seemed to absorb all the ambient sounds of the neighborhood, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the chirping of birds, the rustling of the oak leaves. Officer Miller's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. The initial shock gave way to a flash of panic, his eyes darting towards his partner as if seeking confirmation of the nightmare he had just heard. Officer Calloway simply stared, her expression a mixture of awe and terror. She understood the gravity of the words, "federal judge," in a way Miller, in his ego-driven haze, seemed incapable of processing. Any reasonable officer, upon realizing such a monumental blunder, would have begun a rapid, stumbling retreat filled with frantic apologies. They would have backpedaled off the porch, radioed their supervisor, and prepared for the inevitable and severe repercussions. But Officer Dean Miller was not a reasonable officer. His arrogance was a shield, and he raised it now to protect his fragile ego from the devastating truth. The panic in his eyes was quickly replaced by a sneer of defiance. He couldn't accept that he was wrong, so he had to believe that she was lying. "A federal judge?" he scoffed, the sound harsh and unnatural. He tried to force a laugh, but it came out as a strangled bark. "Yeah, right. Lady, that's a good one. You think that's going to scare me off?" Judge Vance watched him, her expression unchanging. She was no longer engaging him in a debate. She was observing a subject, a case study in self-destruction. "I am not trying to scare you, officer. I am stating a fact. A fact you would be wise to accept." "Prove it," Miller shot back, his confidence returning as he latched onto this new, desperate line of defense. "Anyone can say they're a judge. You show me a badge. You show me some official credentials. Your driver's license doesn't mean anything." He was now accusing a federal judge of impersonating a public official, a felony. He was digging his hole deeper, shoveling faster, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was burying himself. "My judicial identification is inside my home," Judge Vance said, her voice betraying a hint of weariness at the sheer, stubborn foolishness of the man before her. "A home you have no right to enter, and frankly, at this point, I have no intention of trying to convince you further. My identity is a matter of public record. A simple search on your phone would confirm it in 30 seconds. The fact that you haven't done so speaks volumes about your intent here." She was right, and he knew it. His in-car computer, or even his standard-issue smartphone, could have verified her identity instantly. But he hadn't checked because he didn't want to know. He wanted to be right. He wanted the narrative in his head, the one where he was the sharp, vigilant cop catching a minority out of place in a wealthy neighborhood, to be true. "I don't need to search anything," Miller declared, puffing out his chest. "I'm the one in charge here, and I say you're lying. I think you're a squatter, or maybe a house sitter who's trying to pull a fast one. Impersonating a judge is a serious crime." Officer Calloway finally found her voice. "Dean," she began, her tone a quiet warning, "maybe we should just run the name." Miller shot her a venomous glare. "Stay out of this, Calloway. I've got it handled." He turned back to the door, his face flushed with anger. "That's it. I've had enough of this. You are obstructing an investigation, and now you're lying about being a judge. You're coming with us." He had crossed the final line. He was now threatening to arrest a federal judge on her own property based on a fabricated crime and a delusional refusal to accept facts. Judge Vance knew the time for words was over. This officer was not just misguided, he was a danger. He was a man with a badge and a gun who was actively choosing to abuse his power rather than admit a mistake. "You will do no such thing," she said, her voice resonating with cold fury. "If you attempt to lay a hand on me or force your way into my home, you will be committing multiple felonies that will land you in a federal prison. This is your final warning. Leave. Now." But Miller was beyond hearing warnings. His pride was so wounded, his prejudice so entrenched, that he was incapable of rational thought. He saw her final warning not as a lifeline, but as a challenge. He took a deep breath, and with a guttural yell of frustration, he lowered his shoulder and slammed his body against the door. The cheap brass chains snapped, the screws tearing from the wooden frame with a splintering crack. The door flew inward, crashing against the interior wall. And just like that, Officer Dean Miller, in a fit of arrogant rage, committed the irrevocable, career-ending act of illegally breaching the home of a United States federal judge. The sound of splintering wood and the crash of the door against the wall echoed through the cavernous foyer. For a moment, all three of them stood frozen. Judge Vance, though expecting his aggression, was still momentarily stunned by the sheer violence of his entry. Officer Miller, breathing heavily, looked down at the broken chain dangling uselessly from its housing, a wild, triumphant look in his eyes. He had broken through. He had won. Officer Calloway, however, looked horrified. Her training, her understanding of the law, everything screamed at her that they had just stepped over a cliff. Breaking down a door without a warrant, without exigent circumstances, was a cardinal sin of policing. "Now," Miller grunted, stepping fully into the foyer, his boots loud on the marble. "We're going to do this my way." He gestured for Calloway to follow. "Calloway, secure the suspect." Calloway hesitated on the threshold, her face pale. "Dean, this is wrong. We can't do this." "I gave the order. Get in here," he yelled, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. Reluctantly, her expression a mask of dread, she stepped inside, her presence making her complicit in the illegal entry. Judge Vance backed away slowly, putting the mahogany table between herself and the officers. Her mind was a whirlwind of legal statutes being violated. Illegal entry, deprivation of rights under color of law, assault, unlawful restraint. But on the surface, she projected an almost unnerving calm. Her panic, if she felt any, was suppressed. Her focus was on observation, on remembering every detail, every word, every action. "Officer Miller, you have just committed a felony," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the circumstances. "Both of you are now trespassing in my home. Everything that happens from this point forward is being documented." Miller laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Documented by who? You? You think your word against two cops is going to mean anything?" He began to walk around the foyer, picking up a small sculpture from a pedestal and examining it with a proprietary air. "Nice place. Must have cost a fortune. You're a long way from the projects, huh?" The racial slur, so casually delivered, hung in the air. Calloway flinched, as if struck. Eleanor, however, did not react to the bait. Her gaze was fixed on a point just above his head, toward the corner where the ceiling met the wall. Tucked away, almost invisible against the white trim, was a tiny black dome with a single unblinking lens. It was one of 7 such cameras positioned throughout the interior and exterior of her home. What Officer Miller, in his arrogant rampage, didn't know was that Judge Eleanor Vance's husband was a borderline paranoid technophile. After a high-profile case involving a cartel, he had insisted on installing a security system that was less home security and more embassy-grade surveillance. Every camera recorded in 4K high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. Every file was instantly and simultaneously uploaded to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers located in different countries. The system was tamper-proof. Wiping the local hard drive would be useless. The record of this encounter was already stored safely beyond his reach. Every condescending word, every illegal action, his violent entry, it was all being captured from multiple angles. The silent witness was watching, and its memory was perfect. "You need to put your hands behind your back," Miller commanded, setting the sculpture down and starting to advance toward her. "You are under arrest for obstructing an investigation and impersonating a judicial officer." "I am not impersonating anyone," she said, holding her ground. "And you have no lawful investigation to obstruct. You are the one committing a crime." He reached for his handcuffs, the metal links jingling ominously in the quiet room. "Tell it to the booking sergeant." Calloway finally spoke up again, her voice pleading. "Dean, stop. Just listen for a second. What if she's telling the truth? The chief will have our badges for this. Think about it." "She's not telling the truth," Miller roared, his face contorted with rage. He seemed personally offended by the very possibility. "She's a liar trying to get out of a jam. Now, are you going to help me, or are you going to be charged with insubordination?" Seeing Calloway waver, Eleanor knew she had to act. This situation was deteriorating rapidly. Miller was too emotionally compromised to be reasoned with. Arguing the law with a man who was actively breaking it was pointless. She needed to appeal to a higher authority, and not the one Miller thought he represented. She held up one hand, a gesture that paused his advance for a fraction of a second. "Before you do something you will regret for the rest of your life," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You should know that this entire interaction, from the moment you rang my doorbell, has been recorded. Your fabricated premise, your illegal demands, your violent and unlawful entry into my home. It's all on video and audio." Miller's aggressive advance faltered. He glanced around the foyer, his eyes searching, a flicker of genuine fear finally piercing his armor of rage. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" she asked softly. "Look closely, officer, in the corner above the door, and over there by the staircase. My husband is very serious about security." His head swiveled. He followed her gaze and his eyes widened as he finally saw it. The small, dark lens of the camera aimed directly at him. His face went from flushed red to a ghastly ashen white. The recording was real. The silent witness was real. And he had just performed a career-ending, life-altering series of felonies for its unwavering eye. The sight of the camera seemed to suck the air out of the room. Officer Miller stood frozen, his hand hovering near his handcuffs, his face a mask of dawning horror. The smug certainty that had fueled his every action was gone, replaced by the terrifying, cold clarity of a man realizing he has just walked off a cliff. He looked from the camera to Judge Vance, then back to the camera, as if trying to will it out of existence. The silent black lens stared back, an unforgiving eye that had captured everything. Officer Calloway let out a small, audible gasp. She saw the camera too, and unlike Miller, she understood the full implication immediately. It wasn't just their word against a citizen's anymore. There was a tape, an objective, unimpeachable record of their misconduct. "Oh, God, Dean," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She was telling the truth." Miller didn't respond. He seemed to be in a state of shock, the gears in his mind grinding as he tried to process the totality of his miscalculation. He had built a fortress of arrogance, and it had just been leveled by a single, tiny piece of technology. Judge Vance seized the opportunity created by their paralysis. This was her chance to de-escalate the situation on her terms. "The recordings are uploaded to a remote server in real time," she stated calmly, pressing her advantage. There is nothing you can do to erase what you've done. Now I will give you one final opportunity to leave my home before I take my next step." For a moment, it seemed like Miller might comply. The fight had gone out of him. But then a desperate, cornered animal instinct took over. He couldn't undo what he'd done, so he fell back on the only thing he had left, the illusion of authority. This changes nothing," he stammered, though his voice lacked all its previous conviction. You're still under arrest. The camera doesn't—" He trailed off, unable to formulate a coherent justification. Judge Vance simply shook her head, a look of pity on her face. "You had your chance." With a steady hand, she reached into her purse, which was still on the table. Miller tensed, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. Calloway shouted, "Don't!" But Eleanor wasn't reaching for a weapon. She pulled out her smartphone. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She unlocked the screen with her thumb, her eyes never leaving Miller's. He watched, mesmerized by her composure, as her finger tapped the screen a few times. She was not dialing 911. She was not calling her lawyer. She bypassed the entire chain of command that Miller was a part of. She was going straight to the top. She put the phone to her ear. It rang once. A voice on the other end answered. "Mr. Mayor," Judge Vance said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with an authority that dwarfed Officer Miller's. "This is Judge Eleanor Vance. I apologize for calling you on your personal line on a Saturday, but I'm afraid I have an emergency." The words "Mr. Mayor" and "Judge Eleanor Vance" hit Miller like a physical blow. He staggered back a step. He wasn't just dealing with a judge. He was dealing with a judge who had the mayor's personal cell phone number. This was a level of power and influence he couldn't comprehend. He was a street cop who had picked a fight with a giant, and he was only now realizing how small he was. Eleanor continued, her voice a calm narrative of the events that had just transpired. "I am currently in my home at 112 Crescent Drive. 2 of your officers have just forced their way inside without a warrant. Their names are Officer Miller and Officer Calloway. Officer Miller has threatened me with arrest and has refused to accept my identification or believe my judicial status. He has been hostile, unprofessional, and is currently trespassing." She paused, listening to the frantic voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, sir, I am fine for the moment, but they are still in my home and refusing to leave. I believe the police chief needs to be involved immediately. Yes, I'll hold." She stood there, phone to her ear, in the center of her own violated foyer, holding the mayor of the city on the line. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Miller and Calloway were no longer armed officers confronting a suspect. They were 2 rogue employees, trapped in the house of a federal judge, about to face the full and terrifying weight of the city's leadership. Miller looked at Calloway, his face ashen. The bravado, the racism, the arrogance, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind a young, stupid, and profoundly terrified man. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, but no words came out. It was too late. The gears of a machine far more powerful than him were already turning, and he was about to be ground beneath them. He could hear the faint, tinny sound of the mayor's panicked voice coming through the phone's earpiece, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life as he knew it was over. The 10 minutes that followed the phone call were the longest of Officer Miller's life. Judge Vance remained on the line with the mayor, occasionally murmuring, "Yes, sir," or "I understand." Her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frantic energy that was now crackling through the air. Miller and Calloway stood frozen in the foyer like statues in a museum of terrible decisions. They didn't dare move, didn't dare speak. They were trapped, caught between the unblinking eye of the security camera and the furious gaze of the judge. Every second that ticked by was another second of them unlawfully present in her home, another layer of guilt being added to their already damning record. Miller's mind raced, desperately trying to find an escape hatch that didn't exist. He thought about running, just turning and sprinting out the door, but he knew it was useless. He thought about apologizing, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. What could he possibly say? I'm sorry I didn't believe you were human enough to live in this house. I'm sorry my prejudice led me to commit a series of felonies against a federal judge. The first sign of the impending storm was the distant, rapidly approaching wail of sirens. Not just one, but multiple, converging on their location at high speed. This wasn't a standard response. This was a 5-alarm fire call for a political inferno. Miller's blood ran cold. He had worked in law enforcement long enough to know what that sound meant. The brass was coming. A black, unmarked sedan, a high-end model used by city department heads, screeched to a halt in front of the house, ignoring the curb and stopping halfway onto the pristine lawn. The driver's door flew open, and a portly man in a rumpled suit practically fell out of the car. He was sweating profusely despite the mild weather, his face a blotchy red. It was Police Chief Frank Donovan, a man Miller had only ever seen giving speeches at formal events. Donovan didn't even bother to close his car door. He sprinted up the walkway, his eyes wide with a level of panic Miller had never seen in a senior officer. Donovan burst through the still-open doorway, his chest heaving. He took in the scene in a single, horrified glance. The splintered doorframe, the two officers standing stiffly in the foyer, and Judge Eleanor Vance standing calmly by the hall table, still on the phone. "Judge Vance!" Donovan gasped, trying to catch his breath. "Are you all right? Are you harmed?" Eleanor gave him a small, tight nod and spoke into the phone. "Mr. Mayor, Chief Donovan has just arrived. Yes, thank you for your prompt attention to this matter." She ended the call and placed her phone on the table. She then turned her full, undivided attention to the police chief. "Chief Donovan," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "welcome to my home." Donovan visibly winced at her words. He looked at Miller and Calloway, and a flicker of pure, unadulterated rage crossed his face. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. "You two, outside, now!" His voice was a low, guttural roar. Miller and Calloway scurried out of the house like chastened children, their retreat a stark admission of guilt. They stood on the porch, heads bowed, as two more patrol cars, supervisors' vehicles, pulled up with lights flashing, but sirens now silent. The neighborhood was beginning to stir, with curtains parting and a few neighbors stepping out onto their own porches, drawn by the commotion. Donovan turned back to the judge, his face a mixture of apology and damage control. "Judge, on behalf of the entire department, I am so sorry. I cannot begin to express how—" "Save your apologies for now, Chief," Eleanor interrupted, cutting him off cleanly. "They are premature. What you need to do is secure the scene and begin an investigation. Your officers have committed a number of serious crimes here this afternoon." "Yes, of course, Judge. Whatever you need," Donovan said, fumbling for a notebook and pen from his suit pocket. "I'll have internal affairs down here immediately. We'll get their statements. You will do more than that," she stated, her authority absolute. "You will have both officers placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Their service weapons and badges are to be confiscated pending the outcome of a full investigation. And you will instruct them not to speak to anyone without a union representative or an attorney present. They are no longer officers conducting an investigation, they are suspects in a criminal one." Each command was a hammer blow, stripping Miller of his identity layer by layer. His badge, his gun, his authority, all gone. He stood on the porch, listening to his career being dismantled in real time. He could see a supervisor, Sergeant Peterson, approaching him and Calloway, his face grim. Peterson knew. Everyone was going to know. Donovan nodded vigorously at the judge's instructions. "Yes, Judge, consider it done." He was about to say more, to continue his frantic attempts at mollifying her, but she held up a hand. "And one more thing, Chief," she said, her gaze steady and piercing. "Before your Internal Affairs Department begins what I'm sure will be a thorough investigation, you should know something. The entire incident, from the moment Officer Miller rang my bell to this very conversation, has been recorded on a high-definition, multi-angle security system with audio. The footage has already been uploaded to a secure off-site server to which only I have the password." Chief Donovan's face, which had been red and blotchy, drained of all color. It went from crimson to a pasty, sickly white. The sweat on his brow seemed to turn to ice. An apology was for a mistake. Damage control was for a PR problem. But high-definition video evidence of two of his officers illegally breaking into the home of a federal judge? That wasn't a problem. That was a city-burning, career-ending catastrophe. The mention of video evidence changed the very atmosphere in the room. Chief Donovan's posture slumped, the frantic energy of damage control draining out of him, replaced by the heavy resignation of a man facing an unavoidable disaster. The theoretical he said, she said scenario he might have been hoping for had evaporated. In its place was a concrete, immutable record of the afternoon's events. He looked at the small camera dome in the corner with a kind of morbid reverence, as if it were an unexploded bomb. Video, he repeated softly, the word tasting like defeat. I see. Judge, I will personally oversee this. I will ensure there is complete transparency. I expect nothing less, Chief, Judge Vance replied. My attorney will be in contact with your city's legal department on Monday morning with instructions on how to formally request a copy. Until then, the evidence is secure. She was making it clear. She controlled the narrative because she controlled the proof. The police department would not be able to spin, hide, or bury what happened. Outside, the scene was unfolding with grim efficiency. Sergeant Peterson, a veteran with 25 years on the force and a face that showed every one of them, had separated Miller and Calloway. He took Calloway first, speaking to her in low, calm tones. Miller was left standing by the black sedan, isolated and exposed. He could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him, a mixture of pity, contempt, and fear. He was no longer one of them. He was a liability, a disease that had to be quarantined. Peterson approached him next. Miller, he said, his voice flat. Per the chief's order, you're on administrative leave. I need your weapon and your badge. The words, though expected, hit Miller with the force of a punch to the gut. Slowly, robotically, he unbuckled his duty belt and handed the entire rig over to the sergeant. The weight of it, so familiar and reassuring for years, was suddenly gone. He felt lighter, but also terrifyingly vulnerable. Then he reached up and unclipped the heavy silver badge from his chest. It felt cold in his hand. He had polished it just that morning. He looked at it for a moment, the symbol of his power and his identity, now just a piece of metal he was no longer entitled to wear. He handed it to Peterson, their fingers brushing. The transfer was complete. He was no longer Officer Miller, he was just Dean Miller, a civilian in a costume and a criminal suspect. Back inside, Chief Donovan was on his own phone, speaking in clipped, urgent tones to the head of Internal Affairs. No, not Monday. I want the GO team assembled now. I don't care if it's Saturday, Paul. We have a Code 1 emergency. Yes, it involves a federal judge. Yes, it's that bad. Get here. He hung up and turned back to Judge Vance. Judge, again, if there is anything you need... What I need, Chief, is for you to find the record of the initial call, she said, her focus shifting to the root of the problem. Officer Miller claimed he was responding to a report of a suspicious person, a possible break-in. I want to see that report. I want to know which of my neighbors called and exactly what they reported. Donovan nodded quickly. Of course, Peterson can pull the CAD report right from his vehicle. He went to the door and relayed the instruction. Sergeant Peterson, looking increasingly grim, walked back to his patrol car. The entire neighborhood was watching now. The spectacle of a police chief, multiple supervisors, and two disgraced officers on the lawn of the quiet, respected judge was too much to ignore. A few moments later, Peterson returned, a tablet in his hand. He looked at the chief, then at the judge, and his expression was deeply troubled. Chief, he said, there's a problem. What is it? Donovan asked, his voice strained. I've run a search for all calls to this address for the past 48 hours, Peterson reported. I've searched the entire block. I've even searched for any reports matching Miller's unit number for the last 3 hours. He took a deep breath. There's nothing, sir. Absolutely nothing. There was no 911 call. There was no complaint about a suspicious person. As far as the system is concerned, they were never dispatched here. They just showed up. The revelation landed with the force of a second explosion. It was worse than a mismanaged call. It was worse than a case of mistaken identity. The entire premise for Officer Miller's presence at her home was a complete fabrication. He hadn't been acting on bad information. He had been acting on no information at all. He had chosen this house. He had targeted her. The incident was no longer a matter of an officer making a series of escalating mistakes. It had transformed into something far more sinister. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a deliberate act. Chief Donovan stared at Sergeant Peterson, his mouth agape. The question hung in the air, unspoken but screaming in the minds of everyone present. Why? Why would an officer invent a call to harass a citizen in this neighborhood? Why this specific house? Why this specific woman? The investigation had just taken a dark and profound turn, and the unraveling of Officer Dean Miller's career had only just begun. It was about to become the unraveling of his life. The news that the complaint was non-existent sent a chill through Chief Donovan that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. A rogue cop was one thing. A cop who fabricates a reason to target a specific citizen was another thing entirely. It implied premeditation. It suggested a motive beyond a simple, albeit catastrophic, error in judgment. It pointed towards a planned act of harassment, and that act had been carried out against a federal judge. "Are you certain, Sergeant?" Donovan asked, his voice barely a whisper, hoping for some other explanation. "Positive, Chief," Peterson confirmed, showing him the blank search results on his tablet. "No call, no dispatch, no report. Unit 714, Miller's car, went off radio for about 15 minutes, claiming a self-initiated activity. The GPS puts his vehicle on this street at that time, but he never called it in. He manufactured the entire stop." Judge Vance absorbed this new information with a grim stillness. She had suspected as much. Miller's lie about the back window had been too clumsy, too easily disproven. Now she had confirmation. This wasn't random. She had been singled out. The question of why now burned in her mind as well. In her line of work, she made enemies. Had this been an act of retaliation related to a past case? Was Miller connected to someone she had sent to prison? Or was the reason something more primal, more disturbingly simple? Was it just because she was a successful black woman living in a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood? Donovan's mind was racing through the political and legal fallout. A fabricated call elevated this from a departmental failure to a potential federal crime. It was a clear-cut case of deprivation of rights under color of law, carried out with intent. There would be no plea bargain for Miller that didn't involve significant prison time. The city's liability had just skyrocketed from millions to tens of millions. "Get them out of here," Donovan ordered Peterson, his voice a low growl of fury. "Take them to headquarters. Separate them. I want them processed and interviewed by Internal Affairs tonight. Read them their rights. This is a criminal investigation now." Peterson nodded and went to carry out the order. Miller, who had been watching the exchange from the lawn, saw the look on the sergeant's face and knew his fate was sealed. There would be no suspension, no desk duty. This was going to end in a courtroom, with him on the wrong side of the defendant's table. He allowed himself to be led to the back of a patrol car without resistance, his movements stiff and robotic. He was no longer a cop. He was evidence. As the cars pulled away, taking the disgraced officers with them, an uneasy quiet fell over the street once more. The curious neighbors began to retreat into their homes, sensing the acute phase of the drama was over. Chief Donovan remained, standing awkwardly in the judge's magnificent foyer, a man in charge of a department that had just committed an unforgivable sin against the very system of justice it was sworn to uphold. "Judge Vance," he began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know what to say. This is unprecedented." "It's not as unprecedented as you might think, Chief," Eleanor said coolly, her judicial mind already connecting dots. "Officers who are willing to fabricate a call are rarely committing their first transgression. This is likely not Officer Miller's first abuse of power, only his most brazen. You need to pull his file. And his partners. I want to see their complaint histories, their use of force reports, their performance reviews. Everything. It will be done, Donovan promised. And you need to secure their patrol car, she continued, laying out the next steps of the investigation for him. The in-car camera footage might show what they were discussing before they approached my home. You also need to secure their personal cell phones. You'll need a warrant, but given the circumstances, I suspect a judge will sign one for you tonight. Donovan was scribbling furiously in his notepad, a police chief taking orders from the victim of his own officer's crimes. The irony was profound. He was a passenger in an investigation that was now moving with the force of a freight train, and she was the one driving it. That evening, as the sun began to set, the first pieces of the puzzle started to emerge from the internal investigation. Officer Calloway, advised by a frantic union lawyer, gave a preliminary statement. She claimed she had no idea Miller was going to fabricate a call. She said he had been driving through the neighborhood when he saw Judge Vance's Lexus sedan in the driveway. According to Calloway, Miller had made a comment. "I wonder what they're into to afford a place like this." He then pulled over, claiming he was going to check things out. Calloway admitted she felt it was wrong, but was too intimidated by Miller, who was her senior officer and field training officer, to challenge him directly. It was a weak defense, but it provided the crucial motive. It wasn't about a past court case. It wasn't a targeted hit by a criminal syndicate. It was simpler, uglier, and in many ways more damning. Officer Dean Miller had seen a black person in an expensive home, and his prejudiced mind had instantly manufactured a crime. He hadn't seen a citizen, he had seen a suspect. The phantom complaint was born not of a phone call, but of a deep-seated bigotry that he had allowed to dictate his actions as a law enforcement officer. The why was no longer a mystery, and with that confirmation, the door was open to a much wider and more terrifying question. How many other times had he done this? By nightfall, the gears of the city's legal machinery were turning at a speed rarely seen. Chief Donovan, understanding that his own job was on the line, had personally walked a search warrant application over to the home of the on-call Superior Court judge. The warrant, which cited the illegal entry, the fabricated stop, and Calloway's preliminary statement, was for Officer Dean Miller's personal cell phone, his home computer, and his locker at the precinct. The judge signed it without hesitation. The forensics team executed the warrant just after 10 p.m. Miller was at home, sitting in a stunned silence with his bewildered wife, when the detectives from his own department knocked on the door. The search was professional but swift. They took his phone, his laptop, and a tablet. At the precinct, they cut the lock on his locker, bagging every personal item inside. By midnight, the devices were in the hands of the digital forensics unit, and the process of excavating Dean Miller's digital life had begun. What they found was a cesspool. It didn't take long for the first red flags to appear. Miller's social media presence was a carefully curated facade of a patriotic family man. But his private messages and his activity in closed online groups painted a starkly different picture. The lead forensics detective, a quiet, meticulous woman named Detective Isabella Rossi, started with his text messages. Within minutes, she felt a familiar, sickening knot in her stomach. Miller was part of a group chat with 4 other officers from his and a neighboring precinct. The group's name was the Night Watch. Their conversations were a vile stream of racist, misogynistic, and homophobic jokes and memes. They referred to minority communities using derogatory slurs and bragged about their on-duty exploits, which they called keeping the trash out. They shared pictures of expensive cars they pulled over in minority neighborhoods, with captions like, "Another dealer celebrating a good week." As Rossi dug deeper, she found the thread that directly connected the group's hateful ideology to their police work. They maintained a shared, unofficial field interview list on a cloud-based document. It was a list of prominent minority citizens in the city's wealthier neighborhoods: doctors, business owners, lawyers. Next to each name were notes about their cars, their addresses, and flimsy fabricated pretexts for stopping them. Has a broken taillight. Wink, one entry read. Frequently rolls through the stop sign at Elm and 4th, read another. It was a blueprint for systematic, racially motivated harassment. Then, Rossi found the messages from earlier that day. At 2:15 p.m., just an hour before the incident at Judge Vance's home, Miller had sent a picture to the Night Watch group chat. It was a photo of Judge Vance's house, taken from his patrol car. The caption read, "New target acquired, 112 Crescent, Lexus in the driveway. Time to see who's living large in Oak Creek." A fellow officer, one Sergeant Mack, had replied almost instantly, "Careful with that one, Dean. Oak Creek is high profile." Miller's response was chillingly arrogant. "Don't worry. I know how to talk to these people. A little pressure and they fold every time. I'll make something stick." The messages were a prosecutor's dream and a police chief's worst nightmare. They proved premeditation, conspiracy, and a clear racial motive. This wasn't just Miller's bigotry. It was a coordinated effort by a clique of officers who were using their badges to terrorize citizens. The digital footprint laid the entire conspiracy bare. Detective Rossi kept digging. She cross-referenced the names on the harassment list with the department's official CAD and report-writing systems. The pattern was undeniable. Over the past 18 months, the 5 officers in the Night Watch had initiated over 200 traffic stops and field interviews with individuals from their secret list. Nearly 90% of those stops had resulted in no citation and no arrest. They were ghost stops, designed for the sole purpose of intimidation, to remind these successful minority citizens that an officer could disrupt their lives at any time, for any reason. At 3 a.m., Rossi picked up her phone and called Chief Donovan, waking him from a restless sleep. "Chief," she said, her voice grim, "you need to come down here. What we thought was a problem with one officer is much, much bigger. We have a conspiracy." The evidence pulled from Miller's phone was the key that unlocked a hidden world of corruption within the department. His arrogant choice to confront Judge Eleanor Vance was not just a career-ending mistake. It was the thread that, when pulled, would cause an entire web of hatred and abuse of power to unravel. The digital ghosts on his phone had come back to haunt not only him, but everyone he had conspired with. The scope of the scandal was growing exponentially, and the fallout was just beginning. The morning sun rose on a city that was about to be rocked by a scandal of immense proportions. Chief Donovan, looking haggard and aged by a decade in a single night, convened an emergency meeting with the mayor, the city attorney, and the district attorney. In a sterile conference room at City Hall, Detective Rossi laid out the contents of Miller's phone. The racist text messages, the target list, the photo of Judge Vance's home. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of the department's reputation. The district attorney, a sharp, politically ambitious man named Marcus Thorne, listened with a grim expression. When Rossi finished, he shook his head slowly. "Frank," he said to Chief Donovan, "this is beyond internal affairs. The conspiracy, the racial targeting. This is a federal matter. We're looking at a massive civil rights investigation. We have to bring in the DOJ." No one argued. The evidence was too clear, the conspiracy too organized, and the initial victim too powerful. Targeting a federal judge was an attack on the judicial system itself. The U.S. Attorney's Office would take the lead, and the FBI would handle the investigation. As the official gears began to turn, an unofficial process was also starting. News of Miller's arrest, though not the specific details, had been leaked to the press. A local investigative reporter, tipped off by a source within the department, ran a story with the headline, "Oak Creek Officer Arrested After Confrontation at Home of Prominent Judge." The story was vague, but it was enough. For dozens of people across the city, it was a spark in a tinderbox of long-simmering resentment and fear. The first call came into the newly established tip line just after 9 a.m. It was from a man named Dr. Robert Parrish, a celebrated cardiologist. He told the operator, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and vindication, that he had been pulled over by Officer Dean Miller 7 times in the last year. Each time the pretext was trivial, a supposed lane change violation, a claim that his license plate light was too dim. Each stop involved lengthy questioning on the side of the road, sometimes making him late for critical procedures at the hospital. He was never ticketed. He had filed 2 complaints, both of which were dismissed as unfounded. His name was on the list from Miller's phone. The second call was from a woman named Maria Flores, a successful tech entrepreneur. She recounted how Sergeant Mac McIlroy, one of the members of the Night Watch chat, had repeatedly harassed her, pulling her over and asking invasive questions about where she got the money for her car and her home. He had once followed her for 5 miles, all the way to her office, before pulling her over for driving too cautiously. Her name was also on the list. The floodgates had opened. All day the calls poured in. A lawyer who was pulled over and illegally searched by 2 of the conspirators. A small business owner whose store was subjected to repeated, baseless inspections by officers from the clique. A college professor who was detained for loitering while jogging in his own affluent neighborhood. The stories were all different, yet chillingly the same. They were stories of being treated like a criminal for the crime of being a successful person of color. The secret list from Miller's phone was no longer just a digital document. It now had names, faces, and voices, each one a testament to the reign of terror these officers had conducted. The victims, many of whom had suffered in silence, convinced that complaining was futile, now felt empowered. The news that a federal judge had been targeted and had fought back gave them hope that, for the first time, they might be heard. Attorney David Chen, a renowned civil rights lawyer whom Judge Vance had contacted, began fielding calls from these newly emerged victims. His office transformed into a command center for what was quickly becoming one of the largest civil rights lawsuits the state had ever seen. "The pattern is undeniable," Chen told a reporter. "This was not policing. This was a coordinated campaign of racial intimidation orchestrated by a gang of officers who betrayed their oath and their community." The city was in an uproar. Community leaders demanded the immediate firing of all officers involved and the resignation of Chief Donovan. Protesters began to gather outside police headquarters, their signs reading, "End racist policing," and "Badges are not a shield for bigotry." For Dean Miller, sitting in a holding cell, the world he had known had ceased to exist. He had thought his confrontation with Judge Vance was a singular event, a miscalculation he could perhaps explain away. He never imagined that his one act of arrogant prejudice would be the catalyst that would bring his entire secret world crashing down around him, exposing him and his friends and unleashing a wave of righteous anger from the very people they had sworn to protect, but had chosen to torment instead. The consequences of his actions were no longer just about him. They were about every single life he and his co-conspirators had damaged. Within 48 hours of the incident, the situation had escalated far beyond the control of the city's leadership. The U.S. Attorney for the district, a formidable woman named Brenda Shore, formally announced that the Department of Justice was opening a full-scale civil rights investigation into the city's police department. The press conference was broadcast live on national news. Standing before a bank of microphones, with a steely expression, Shore made the gravity of the situation clear. "The allegations that have emerged over the past 2 days are profoundly disturbing," she began, her voice resonating with authority. "They suggest a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing by a number of officers within the department. The initial incident, involving the unlawful entry into the home of a sitting United States federal judge, is an attack not just on a citizen, but on the very fabric of our justice system. As such, the full weight and resources of the United States Department of Justice will be brought to bear." The announcement sent shockwaves through the national law enforcement community. A DOJ pattern and practice investigation was the most serious level of federal oversight a police department could face. It meant that federal investigators, led by the FBI, would have the power to subpoena records, compel testimony, and scrutinize every aspect of the department's operations, from hiring and training to internal discipline and use of force policies. The first FBI agents arrived that same afternoon. They were a different breed from the local detectives. Dressed in sharp, conservative suits, they moved with a quiet, focused intensity. They didn't take over the investigation so much as absorb it. They set up a command post in a federal building downtown, and their first act was to take possession of all the evidence collected by the local police, including Miller's phone and computer, the patrol car's dash cam footage, and the initial interview notes with Officer Calloway. They also sent a formal request to Judge Vance's attorney for a copy of her security camera footage. For Chief Donovan, the arrival of the feds was both a humiliation and a relief. His department was now effectively under a microscope, its failings to be laid bare for the nation to see. But it also meant the immense pressure of the investigation was no longer solely on his shoulders. The FBI would be thorough, impartial, and immune to local political influence or the pressures of the police union. The police union, which had initially issued a boilerplate statement about due process for Officer Miller, fell silent. The evidence emerging from Miller's phone, the racist chats, the conspiracy, was indefensible. They quietly shifted their strategy from a public defense to private legal counsel for the accused officers, preparing for the inevitable criminal charges. The scope of the federal investigation was breathtaking. FBI agents began re-interviewing every victim who had called the tip line, meticulously documenting their stories. They pulled years' worth of internal affairs files, looking for complaints that had been improperly dismissed. They analyzed traffic stop data for the entire department, searching for statistical evidence of racial profiling. They were not just building a case against Miller and his clique, they were conducting a top-to-bottom audit of the department's culture. Judge Vance, while remaining the central victim, wisely recused herself from any official involvement in the investigation to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. She continued her work on the bench, a symbol of the judiciary's resilience. However, she gave a full, detailed deposition to the FBI in the presence of her attorney. She calmly recounted the events of that Saturday, her testimony a masterclass in precision and clarity. Then, she handed over the hard drive containing the video footage. The lead FBI agent, a seasoned investigator named Special Agent Marcus Thorne, watched the footage in a darkened room with U.S. Attorney Brenda Shore. They saw it all. Miller's arrogant questions, his refusal to accept her ID, his violent breach of the door, his racist taunts. They heard every word of Calloway's feeble protests and Miller's enraged shouts. The video was more than just evidence. It was a stunning, real-time depiction of the absolute corruption of power. When the video ended, Thorne turned to Shore. "There it is," he said, his voice grim. "Deprivation of rights, conspiracy, obstruction. It's all there. This isn't just a career ender. This is hard federal time." Brenda Shore nodded. "This video will be Exhibit A. I want indictments drawn up for Miller and the other 4 members of his Night Watch. And I want them arrested by federal agents. I want a clear message sent. If you abuse the badge to violate the civil rights of the citizens you are sworn to protect, you will answer to the United States of America." The intervention of federal justice had transformed the case. It was no longer a local scandal. It was a national referendum on police accountability. The federal indictments came down on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the incident. They were unsealed simultaneously with a series of coordinated pre-dawn raids. FBI SWAT teams, not local police, executed the arrest warrants. Dean Miller was taken from his home in handcuffs, his wife watching in tears as federal agents led him to an unmarked vehicle. Sergeant Mac McIlroy and the other 3 members of the Night Watch were arrested at their homes or as they arrived for their shifts. The message was unmistakable. The blue wall of silence would not protect them from federal law. The 5 officers were charged with a host of federal crimes, including conspiracy to violate civil rights and multiple counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. The indictment listed not only the incident with Judge Vance, but also detailed several of the other harassment cases that had come to light, establishing a clear pattern of criminal activity. Each officer faced the prospect of decades in federal prison. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the damning text messages, the victim testimonies, and the crystal-clear video of the encounter with Judge Vance, the united front of the conspiracy began to crack. The realities of federal prosecution are starkly different from local courts. The conviction rate is over 95%, and the sentences are harsh and unforgiving. The bravado that had defined the night watch in their private chats evaporated in the cold reality of a federal holding cell. The first to break was Officer Calloway. Although not part of the core conspiracy, she was charged as an accessory for her presence and failure to intervene during the illegal breach of Judge Vance's home. Her lawyer, a shrewd and pragmatic defense attorney, knew she was facing a choice: be a minor defendant crushed alongside the main conspirators, or be the government's star witness. The choice was obvious. A proffer session was arranged with the U.S. Attorney's Office. In a sterile government meeting room with her lawyer by her side, a terrified Jessica Calloway told the prosecutors everything she knew. She detailed the culture of racism and impunity that Miller and his friends cultivated. She recounted other incidents she had witnessed, times when Miller had pulled over minority drivers for no reason, using his position to bully and intimidate. She explained how he, as her field training officer, had tried to instill in her the same prejudiced worldview, teaching her that certain people didn't belong in certain neighborhoods. Her testimony was crucial. It provided an insider's perspective, a narrative thread that tied all the digital evidence and victim statements together. She could testify to Miller's state of mind, his motivations, and his casual disdain for the law he was sworn to uphold. In exchange for her full and truthful cooperation and testimony against all 5 co-conspirators, the U.S. Attorney's Office offered her a plea deal. She would plead guilty to a single count of misprision of a felony, the crime of concealing knowledge of a felony, a charge that would likely result in probation and no prison time. It would end her career, but it would save her from federal incarceration. She accepted the deal. Calloway's decision to cooperate sent a shockwave of panic through the other defendants. Their lawyers immediately knew that the government's already overwhelming case had just become virtually unbeatable. They now had an eyewitness from inside the blue wall who would testify against them. One by one, the other, more junior members of the conspiracy began to flip as well. They saw the writing on the wall. They turned on their ringleader, Sergeant McIlroy, and his most aggressive protege, Dean Miller, in hopes of receiving lighter sentences. They confirmed the existence of the target list, admitted to the coordinated harassment, and painted a picture of a toxic subculture driven by McIlroy's racist ideology and Miller's eagerness to put it into practice. Only 2 refused to cooperate: McIlroy and Miller. McIlroy, a bitter 20-year veteran, was too entrenched in his hateful worldview to ever admit wrongdoing. And Miller, the catalyst for the entire scandal, was trapped by his own arrogance. He clung to the delusional belief that he could somehow justify his actions, that a jury would see him not as a racist criminal, but as a proactive cop who made a mistake. His lawyer argued with him, pleaded with him to take a deal, but Miller refused. He was going to take his chances at trial. The conspiracy had crumbled from within, brought down by the weight of its own corruption and the survival instincts of its weaker members. The stage was now set for a trial that would not be a whodunit, but a public dissection of a racist conspiracy, with Dean Miller, the man who started it all, sitting alone at the center of the storm. The trial of Officer Dean Miller and Sergeant Terrence McElroy began 6 months later. The federal courthouse was a media circus. News vans lined the streets, and a queue of citizens, activists, and legal observers snaked around the block, hoping to get one of the few public seats in the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Eleanor Vance was not present, as she was the primary victim and a witness, but her presence loomed large over the proceedings. The jury, a diverse panel of 12 citizens selected from across the district, seemed acutely aware of the historical significance of the case. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Brenda Shore herself, opened with a powerful and damning statement. "This is a case about a betrayal," she told the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. "A betrayal of the badge, a betrayal of the oath, and a betrayal of the public trust. You will hear evidence of a calculated, racially motivated conspiracy by these men to use their power not to protect citizens, but to terrorize them." The defense attorneys for Miller and McElroy offered a weak rebuttal. They attempted to portray their clients as dedicated, if overzealous, officers who were being made scapegoats for larger systemic issues. They argued the text messages were locker room talk, taken out of context, and that the traffic stops were all based on legitimate law enforcement concerns. The argument crumbled on the first day of testimony. The prosecution called a parade of victims to the stand. Dr. Parrish, the cardiologist, recounted his repeated harassment by Miller, his voice thick with emotion as he described the stress and humiliation. Maria Flores described how McElroy's constant stops made her feel like a prisoner in her own city. Each story built upon the last, painting a devastating picture of systematic abuse. Then, the government's star witnesses, the former officers who had taken plea deals, took the stand. One by one, they implicated Miller and McElroy, describing the inner workings of the Night Watch, the creation of the target list, and the racist ideology that underpinned it all. Their testimony was a chilling look behind the curtain of police corruption. But the centerpiece of the trial, the moment the entire courtroom had been waiting for, was the playing of the security camera footage from Judge Vance's home. The courtroom lights were dimmed, and the large screens flickered to life. The jury watched, transfixed, as the events of that Saturday afternoon unfolded in high definition. They saw Officer Miller's aggressive posture and heard his condescending tone. They heard Judge Vance's calm, patient explanations. They saw her pass her driver's license through the door, only to have Miller dismiss it. They heard her reveal her identity as a federal judge, and then they saw Miller's fatal choice: the sneer, the disbelief, and the accusation of impersonation. A collective gasp went through the courtroom as the jury watched Miller lower his shoulder and slam into the door. The sound of splintering wood filled the silent room. They saw him illegally breach the home, shout at his partner, and hurl racist insults at the judge. They witnessed in undeniable detail the absolute and terrifying abuse of power. Dean Miller could not watch the screen. He stared down at the defendant's table, his face pale, his hands trembling. The man on the screen, arrogant, hateful, and out of control, was him, and there was no denying it. The video played for 17 minutes, and with every passing second, it erased any shred of doubt about his guilt. When the lights came up, Brenda Shore stood before the jury. "What you just saw," she said softly, "was not policing. It was a crime born of prejudice and arrogance, a crime that might have gone unpunished, like hundreds of others, if the man who committed it hadn't made one fatal miscalculation. He picked the wrong house." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The court clerk's voice was steady as he read the verdict. "On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights, we, the jury, find the defendant, Dean Miller, guilty." He repeated the word guilty for every single count on the indictment. McElroy received the same verdict. A wave of quiet emotion swept through the courtroom. Victims wept silently, holding hands. Civil rights advocates nodded grimly. Justice, in this case, had been swift and decisive. At the defendant's table, Dean Miller finally looked up, his face a hollow mask of despair. The life he had known, the career he had destroyed, the family he had shamed, it was all gone. He had been so certain of his power, so sure of his place in the world. Now, his future would be defined by the four walls of a federal prison cell. The sentencing took place a month later. The courtroom was once again packed, but the energy was different, less tense, more somber. The presiding judge, brought in from another district to avoid any conflict of interest, delivered a blistering condemnation of the officers' actions before handing down their sentences. Sergeant Terrence McIlroy, as the ringleader and senior officer, received 17 years in federal prison. The other co-conspirators who had cooperated received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years. Then, the judge turned to Dean Miller. He looked down at the disgraced former officer who stood pale and gaunt before the bench. "Mr. Miller," the judge said, his voice laced with contempt, "you were the spark that ignited this fire. Your actions on that Saturday were not a momentary lapse in judgment. They were the inevitable result of a deep-seated prejudice you allowed to fester and guide your conduct as a sworn officer of the law. You did not just break down a door. You broke the faith between the community and the police. You did not just assault a citizen, you assaulted the very principles of equality and justice." Dean Miller was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, he didn't look back. His career, which began with an oath to protect and serve, had ended in a federal felony conviction. The consequences of his single, hate-fueled decision were absolute. The case of United States versus Miller et al. Became a landmark in the ongoing struggle for police reform. The city entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice, agreeing to sweeping, federally monitored changes in its police department's training, oversight, and disciplinary procedures. The pattern and practice investigation uncovered systemic issues that went far beyond Miller's clique, forcing a painful but necessary reckoning within the city's leadership. Chief Donovan was forced to resign, his career another piece of collateral damage from the explosion Miller had set off. Judge Eleanor Vance, with her characteristic grace and strength, became a reluctant but powerful national voice for judicial integrity and police accountability. She had not sought the role, but she accepted the responsibility that came with it. Her home, once a crime scene, was repaired, but the memory of that day would forever serve as a reminder of how fragile the boundary between order and chaos truly is. Justice had been served, but the scars on the community remained. What drives a man like Dean Miller? It's a question worth asking because his actions, while extreme, spring from a source that is tragically common. At its core, his downfall was not just about racism. It was about a profound and toxic insecurity. He likely saw the world through a lens of perceived grievance. In his mind, people of color who achieved the level of success that Judge Vance embodied hadn't earned it. They had somehow cheated the system, his system. Her Lexus, her stately home, her very presence in Oak Creek Estates was not a symbol of the American dream, but a personal affront to his sense of order and entitlement. When he stood on her porch, he wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing a symbol of everything he felt was wrong with the world. His badge gave him the power to act on that insecurity, to try and put the world back into an order that made sense to him, an order where he was on top. The aggression, the refusal to back down, it was the desperate flailing of a man terrified that the world was leaving him behind. His racism was the language his insecurity spoke. We must also ask, what if things had been different? What if Judge Vance hadn't had that state-of-the-art security system? Her word, the word of a respected federal judge, might still have prevailed, but it would have been a grueling battle against the word of two officers. The video provided an objective truth that short-circuited the entire he said, she said defense, reminding us of the vital role technology can play in ensuring accountability. What if she hadn't been a judge? What if she had been a doctor, a teacher, or a business owner? The response from the city's leadership might have been slower, less decisive. Her position gave her a platform and access that the average citizen, like the other victims on Miller's list, did not have. Her story is a testament to her strength, but it is also a sobering reminder that justice should not depend on the social standing of the victim. It must be absolute for all. Ultimately, this story began with a choice made by one man on a sunny Saturday afternoon. He chose suspicion over respect. He chose arrogance over humility. He chose prejudice over procedure. That choice unraveled his life and exposed a sickness that he and others had hidden behind a badge. It serves as a powerful lesson that true authority is not derived from a uniform or a weapon, but from integrity. And those who abuse their power will eventually face a reckoning, because while justice may sometimes be slow, its memory is long, and its weight, when it falls, is absolute. I'm left thinking about the silent partner, Officer Calloway. What do you think is the real responsibility of a bystander in a situation like that? At what point does silence become complicity? Also, have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong but felt powerless to speak up? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and perspectives are what make this community so important.